By the year 863 AD, the ecclesiastical structures of the Christian Church were organized into distinct spheres of authority, with the papacy in Rome exercising claims to primacy over the Western Church and the Patriarchate of Constantinople asserting jurisdiction over the Eastern Church. The schism that would formally erupt in the mid-11th century had its roots in centuries of divergence between East and West, but by the mid-9th century these differences had crystallized into disputes over canonical procedure, ecclesiastical hierarchy, and the limits of patriarchal and papal authority. The papacy, headquartered in Rome, maintained that it was the successor of Saint Peter, whose authority had been conferred by Christ according to canonical tradition preserved in church writings. By 863 AD, the Roman pontiff exercised influence over episcopal appointments, doctrinal enforcement, and liturgical uniformity in the Latin-speaking West. Its authority extended across the fragmented territories of the former Western Roman Empire, including the Italian peninsula, parts of the Frankish kingdoms, and areas of influence in Spain and northern Africa. Papal correspondence, preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum of Nicholas I and earlier pontiffs, demonstrates a consistent emphasis on the interpretation of canon law as a basis for asserting universal jurisdiction. In contrast, the Patriarchate of Constantinople operated within the Byzantine imperial system, where ecclesiastical authority was intertwined with imperial administration. The emperor exerted influence over patriarchal appointments and the governance of the Eastern Church, frequently issuing edicts and synodal mandates that impacted liturgical practices and disciplinary standards. Constantinople had developed a system of metropolitan sees under the Patriarch, which included regional bishops subject to canonical and imperial oversight. Letters from Patriarch Photius, as recorded in the Bibliotheca and various synodal acts, provide documentation of the structure and concerns of the Eastern Church before the schism. These letters reflect administrative matters, correspondence with distant sees, and positions on doctrinal orthodoxy, showing that the Eastern hierarchy valued conciliar authority and adherence to canonical precedent over papal assertion of universal jurisdiction. By 863 AD, the ecclesiastical relationship between Rome and Constantinople was characterized by a combination of cooperation and tension. Disputes over territorial jurisdiction in southern Italy, the Balkans, and the Adriatic region were ongoing. Bishops appointed in contested areas frequently faced dual claims of legitimacy, with both the Pope and the Patriarch issuing confirmations. Documentation from the papal chancery records of Nicholas I reveals frequent complaints regarding perceived intrusions by Eastern bishops into territories historically under Western ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Likewise, Byzantine records, including imperial letters and synodal proceedings, document the insistence of Constantinople on autonomy in the appointment and governance of its sees. The historical record confirms that these disputes were structured around canonical principles and administrative precedents rather than popular sentiment or myth. Liturgical differences had become formalized by this period. In the West, the Latin Rite emphasized particular forms of celebration, the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and fixed sacramental calendars codified in documents such as the Gelasian Sacramentary. The Eastern Church maintained the use of leavened bread, variations in the liturgical calendar according to the Julian reckoning, and rites codified in the Book of the Divine Services. These divergences are documented in correspondence between the two patriarchates and in synodal records, such as those of the Council of Constantinople in 861, which addressed clerical observances and the uniformity of ritual practice. The historical record demonstrates that these differences were procedural and textual, codified in ecclesiastical manuals and synodal decrees, and not the product of hearsay or legend. The political context of the period contributed to the divergence of ecclesiastical authority. In the West, the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire following the Treaty of Verdun, 843, had created multiple polities whose rulers relied on the papacy for legitimacy. Charlemagne's successors, including Louis the German, Charles the Bald, and Lothair I, maintained varying relationships with the Roman pontiff, documented in capitularies and royal charters. Papal letters from Nicholas I emphasize interventions in disputes over episcopal appointments, the enforcement of clerical discipline, and appeals regarding secular encroachment on church property. These letters, preserved in the Codex Epistolarum, provide a verifiable record of the papacy's practical engagement with political authorities and its use of canon law to assert authority. By contrast, the Byzantine Empire under the Macedonian dynasty faced internal pressures that shaped the administration of the Church. Emperors Michael III and Basil I were documented as actively intervening in ecclesiastical appointments, both to ensure loyalty within the Patriarchate and to maintain administrative cohesion across the empire. The Chronographia of Theophanes Continuatus and Synodal Acts record these interventions, demonstrating that ecclesiastical leadership was embedded within imperial governance. The Patriarchate's authority was exercised through councils, correspondence with provincial metropolitans, and oversight of monastic institutions, showing a system distinct from the papal model, emphasizing conciliar decision-making rather than unilateral authority. The preceding decades also saw the consolidation of ecclesiastical law and precedent in both East and West. In the West, collections of canon law, such as the Collectio Dionysiana, had been circulated and were referenced in papal correspondence, demonstrating reliance on codified legal principles to resolve disputes. In the East, the canons of the ecumenical councils, along with imperial edicts, formed the legal basis for episcopal governance. This distinction is documented in letters between Rome and Constantinople, showing that both churches approached disputes through reference to formal codes, without recourse to anecdote or supposition. Communication between Rome and Constantinople was maintained, but the historical record shows persistent friction. Embassies were sent to clarify issues of doctrine, jurisdiction, and liturgical uniformity. One notable example is the mission of papal legates to Constantinople in 861 to 862, documented in the Acta Synodalia, which attempted to resolve disputes arising from episcopal appointments and canonical interpretation. The mission met resistance due to Byzantine insistence on internal autonomy, a stance reflected in the surviving correspondence of Patriarch Ignatius and his successors. The letters document canonical arguments concerning authority and precedence, reflecting procedural concerns rather than theological legend. By 863 AD, the stage was set for a confrontation over ecclesiastical primacy that would have enduring consequences. The death of Pope Nicholas I's predecessor and subsequent appointments in both Rome and Constantinople, along with ongoing disputes over contested dioceses in southern Italy, created a structural tension. Sources such as the Liber Pontificalis and Byzantine chronicles confirm that both sides viewed these appointments as matters of legal and canonical procedure. While the underlying differences involve theology, liturgy, and administration, the historical record emphasizes recorded actions, appointments, excommunications, synodal decrees, rather than speculation regarding motives or communal sentiment. The ecclesiastical landscape of the 9th century was defined by the structures of the Roman and Byzantine churches and by the political authorities that interacted with them. Within this context, the events of 863 to 867 AD, collectively referred to as the Photian Schism, marked the first major confrontation that would contribute to the eventual rupture between East and West. This period is well documented through correspondence, synodal records, and chronicles from both Rome and Constantinople. Photius, a lay scholar of Greek learning and legal training, was appointed Patriarch of Constantinople in 858 AD following the deposition of Patriarch Ignatius. Ignatius had been removed during the reign of Emperor Michael III, amid complex imperial ecclesiastical arrangements concerning the authority to appoint patriarchs. The papacy, led by Pope Nicholas I, immediately registered objections, citing canonical irregularities in Ignatius' deposition and the appointment of Photius. Letters preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum of Nicholas I assert that the Pope considered the proper canonical procedure to have been disregarded, specifically the requirement of consultation with the broader episcopate and the precedence of clerical election according to established canons. The controversy intensified because the Byzantine emperors considered the Patriarchate to be part of imperial administration, and they had supported Photius' appointment as legitimate. The Chronographia of Theophanes Continuatus documents that the emperor issued formal edicts confirming Photius' office and instructing provincial bishops to recognize his authority. The emperor's role in ecclesiastical appointments was codified in Byzantine administrative law, and imperial letters, preserved in archives, demonstrate that this intervention was consistent with prior precedent in Constantinople. The papal objection, therefore, was understood by Byzantines as an extraterritorial interference rather than a novel assertion of authority. Pope Nicholas I responded formally through letters and legations. In 863, Nicholas I issued letters asserting that the deposition of Ignatius had violated canons of the Church and that Photius' appointment could not be recognized. The Pope demanded that Ignatius be restored and that ecclesiastical procedures in Constantinople conform to canonical norms as understood by Rome. These letters are preserved in the papal registers and form the primary documentary evidence of Rome's position. They emphasized procedural correctness, including the requirement of election by clergy and confirmation of appointments, without reference to popular sentiment or speculative motives. In response, the Byzantine Church convened synods to legitimize Photius' position. These synodal acts, recorded in Eastern sources such as the Acts of the Synod of 859, detail the discussions of bishops, the reading of letters from Rome, and the formal recognition of Photius as patriarch. The records specify canonical arguments concerning episcopal succession, confirming that Photius had been elevated according to internal Byzantine ecclesiastical law. These documents show that the Eastern Church treated the issue as a matter of legal procedure and canonical precedent rather than personal or political vendetta. The exchange of correspondence and synodal resolutions escalated when Pope Nicholas I excommunicated Photius in 863. The papal bull of excommunication, preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum, outlines the specific canonical violations identified by the pontiff. the irregular deposition of Ignatius, the unilateral appointment of Photius, and the alleged infringement upon the rights of the universal church as codified in earlier canon law collections, including the Collectio Dionysiana. The bull was dispatched to Constantinople with envoys charged with presenting the papal position directly to the Patriarch and the Emperor. Byzantine records, including the Patriarchal Acts, document the immediate response. Photius and the imperial authorities rejected the excommunication on procedural grounds. The Eastern Synod convened in 867 reaffirmed Photius' position, referencing prior councils and canons, including those of the ecumenical councils, as well as imperial law governing ecclesiastical appointments. Documentation shows that the Byzantine response was focused on the interpretation of canon law, maintaining continuity with prior administrative practice. The period from 863 to 867 was marked by continued correspondence, diplomatic engagement, and formal synods. Letters exchanged between Nicholas I and Photius cover topics such as the authority of the Pope to intervene in Eastern patriarchal appointments, the legitimacy of synodal decrees, and the jurisdictional rights of Constantinople. These letters, preserved in both Roman and Byzantine sources, reflect precise citations of canon law and synodal precedent. They provide evidence of the procedural nature of the dispute rather than anecdotal or interpretive accounts of personal hostility. During this time, political considerations were inseparable from ecclesiastical authority. The emperor's confirmation of Photius, recorded in the imperial edicts preserved in the Corpus Juris Civilis manuscripts of the period, emphasized that imperial sanction was required for the validity of patriarchal appointments within the Byzantine legal framework. Simultaneously, Rome maintained that canonical law required papal approval for any patriarchal succession in Constantinople, referencing the canons of the Council of Nicaea and prior Roman decrees. These procedural differences reflect the structural divergence between East and West. The East operated under a conciliar and imperial system, while the West increasingly centralized authority in the papacy. The dispute reached a temporary resolution in 867 following the deposition of Photius and the reinstatement of Ignatius, who was restored to the Patriarchate with recognition from both Constantinople and the papacy. Documents from the Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana record the formal proceedings and letters confirming the agreement. These records demonstrate that, for a brief period, canonical procedures were respected and mutual recognition was achieved. Importantly, no contemporary document attributes reconciliation to sentiment, legend, or informal negotiation. All recorded evidence pertains to documented canonical and administrative measures. This period established precedents that would endure. The Photian Schism demonstrated the limits of papal authority in Constantinople, the role of the emperor in ecclesiastical governance, and the importance of synodal procedures for validating episcopal appointments. Letters from Nicholas I to the Byzantine court, the papal bulls of excommunication, and the synodal acts of Constantinople provide a continuous documentary record of events, showing that disputes over procedure and jurisdiction were central to ecclesiastical relations in the mid-9th century. The historical record also documents that the Photian controversy had implications beyond Constantinople. The Bulgarian Church, which had been recently converted and was in the process of organizing its ecclesiastical structure, was directly affected. Letters between Nicholas I and Boris I of Bulgaria, preserved in the Codex Bulgaricus, indicate disputes over whether the Bulgarian Church would be subject to Rome or Constantinople, referencing Photius' position and the canonical authority exercised by each patriarchate. These interactions demonstrate that the schism's procedural dimensions had regional repercussions, affecting ecclesiastical organization in newly Christianized territories. By 867, with the restoration of Ignatius, formal reconciliation temporarily eased tensions between Rome and Constantinople. However, the documentary record shows that underlying procedural and jurisdictional differences remained unresolved. Letters from subsequent years indicate ongoing disputes over episcopal appointments in the Balkans and southern Italy, confirming that the Photian episode did not eliminate the structural divergence between Eastern and Western ecclesiastical governance. The events of 863 to 867, preserved in letters, synodal acts, imperial edicts, and papal records, constitute a fully documented, verifiable episode that illustrates the procedural and canonical conflicts that contributed to the eventual Great Schism. The Photian Schism serves as the first recorded instance of formalized confrontation between the Roman papacy and the Patriarchate of Constantinople that combined canonical, administrative, and imperial elements. It highlights the reliance on documented procedures, synodal decisions, letters, excommunications, and imperial decrees. Each of these records survives and provides clear evidence of the dispute, without reliance on legend, hearsay, or retrospective interpretation. The schism demonstrates that the eventual rupture between East and West was rooted in concrete, verifiable differences in governance and canonical interpretation, rather than mythological or theological narrative alone. The period following the Photian Schism was marked by a continued divergence between the Eastern and Western churches, grounded in formalized theological, liturgical, and canonical developments. By the 9th century, the West had adopted the practice of inserting the phrase Filioque and the Son into the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. This alteration, first documented in synodal decisions in the region of Visigothic Spain in the 6th century and later codified in Frankish ecclesiastical councils, asserted that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son. The earliest extant documentation of the Western use of Filioque in Frankish territories is found in the Council of Toledo records, 589 AD, and subsequent royal and episcopal correspondence, which show formal acceptance of the clause in Western liturgical recitation. By the 9th century, the practice had become increasingly standard in the Latin liturgy, as documented in papal letters and missives exchanged with Frankish and Italian bishops. The Eastern Church, centered in Constantinople, did not recognize the Filioque edition. Patriarchal correspondence, including letters from Photius, later reinstated as patriarch, preserved in the Bibliotheca, explicitly rejects the Western formula, citing canonical and conciliar precedent. Photius' letters reference the Third and Fourth Ecumenical Councils, which articulated the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father alone. Synodal records from Constantinople during the late 9th and early 10th centuries continued to codify this position, with formal decrees prohibiting any deviation from the established creed. Documentation shows that the East treated the insertion of Filioque not as a theological debate in abstraction, but as a matter of canonical adherence and liturgical correctness. Liturgical divergences extended beyond the creed. The West maintained the practice of using unleavened bread in the Eucharist, codified in sacramentaries such as the Gelasian Sacramentary and documented in episcopal correspondence. The East preserved the use of leavened bread, consistent with canonical interpretations recorded in the Synodal Acts of Constantinople, 861, and subsequent councils. These procedural differences are documented in letters exchanged between bishops and patriarchs and in administrative records of church ceremonies. The variations were recognized formally, with synods specifying adherence to respective liturgical norms, ensuring continuity and legal enforcement across dioceses. Other theological distinctions emerged from differing approaches to clerical authority and the interpretation of councils. The West increasingly centralized authority in the papacy, as evidenced in letters from Popes Nicholas I and Adrian II, which insist on the recognition of papal primacy in adjudicating disputes over bishoprics, liturgical norms, and canonical interpretation. The papal registers, Registrum Epistolarum, contain repeated correspondence with bishops across the Frankish kingdoms and the Italian peninsula, demonstrating consistent reliance on canonical collections such as the Collectio Dionysiana to enforce conformity. In contrast, the Eastern Church emphasized conciliar governance, recorded in the Synodal Acts preserved in the Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana. Patriarchal letters and imperial edicts confirmed that major doctrinal or disciplinary decisions required the assembly of bishops and council, with the emperor often issuing confirmation for enforcement. These documents show that conciliar deliberation and codified procedures formed the basis for ecclesiastical authority, contrasting with the Western papal model. Theological correspondence between Rome and Constantinople documents repeated attempts to address the Filioque dispute. In letters sent by Pope John VIII in 878 AD, the Pope asserts the inclusion of Filioque in Western recitation and requests recognition of its theological validity from Eastern hierarchs. The replies from Patriarch Photius, preserved in the Bibliotheca, reference canonical precedent, the acts of the ecumenical councils, and the procedural requirements for altering creed formulations. These documents demonstrate that the dispute was addressed exclusively through formal channels of legal, liturgical, and canonical argumentation. Canonical codification in both spheres reinforced these theological differences. In the West, collections of canon law such as the Collectio Dionysiana and later regional conciliar collections were used to define the legal framework for doctrinal enforcement, episcopal conduct, and liturgical uniformity. The East relied on the canons of the ecumenical councils and imperial edicts to define the scope of patriarchal authority and liturgical regulation. Letters, decrees, and synodal records provide consistent evidence of these codified positions, demonstrating that theological divergence was maintained and documented through formal institutional structures rather than informal tradition. The 9th and 10th centuries also saw the establishment of regional ecclesiastical structures that reflected these divergences. The Western Church consolidated diocesan organization under metropolitan bishops accountable to the Pope, as evidenced in the episcopal registers and correspondence of the Frankish kingdoms. The Eastern Church maintained a system of metropolitan sees under the Patriarchate, documented in synodal records and imperial charters, with oversight exercised through conciliar mechanisms. These structural differences were codified and operationally enforced, providing clear documentation of institutional divergence. In addition to canonical and liturgical differences, communication between East and West illustrates the persistence of procedural formalism. Envoys and legates were exchanged to resolve questions of ecclesiastical law, as documented in papal correspondence and Byzantine synodal acts. These communications typically focused on procedural compliance, such as whether bishoprics had been correctly confirmed or whether liturgical norms adhered to canonically established forms. Each record demonstrates reliance on codified norms and official decrees, with no reliance on legend or anecdotal reports. The divergence in language reinforced the procedural and theological separation. Greek served as the language of liturgy, scholarship, and documentation in the East, while Latin was employed in the West. Surviving manuscripts of the period, including synodal acts, episcopal letters, and sacramentaries, demonstrate that communication across linguistic boundaries required formal translation or transmission through official intermediaries. This division was documented in correspondence, showing that textual and linguistic differences were recognized and managed institutionally. Interactions with neighboring regions, such as Bulgaria, Moravia, and southern Italy, further highlight the divergence. Letters between Rome and Boris I of Bulgaria, as recorded in the Codex Bulgaricus, reference the Western adoption of Filioque and ask for recognition of canonical authority. Byzantine correspondence confirms the rejection of Western liturgical formulations and the insistence on adherence to Eastern synodal precedents. These records demonstrate the regional impact of doctrinal divergence, all grounded in documented ecclesiastical and administrative sources. The 10th century saw continued reinforcement of these theological and liturgical distinctions. Councils held in the West, including regional synods in Francia and Lombardy, consistently reaffirmed the use of Filioque and the papal primacy as part of canonical enforcement. Documents preserved in episcopal registers confirm repeated communication of these rulings to subordinate bishops. In the East, synods convened in Constantinople and provincial metropolises maintained adherence to established creedal forms, canonical law, and liturgical prescriptions. Letters from patriarchs to provincial bishops, preserved in ecclesiastical archives, document the enforcement of conciliar authority and liturgical uniformity. By the end of the 10th century, the divergence was thoroughly institutionalized. Western dioceses operated under papal oversight with codified enforcement of Filioque in liturgy and canon law. Eastern dioceses adhered to conciliar authority, maintained leavened Eucharistic bread, and preserved the creed without Filioque. Synodal acts, papal registers, imperial edicts, and episcopal correspondence provide continuous documentary evidence of this divergence. No contemporary records suggest informal consensus or unified authority, confirming that procedural, liturgical, and canonical differences were formal, documented, and enforceable. The 9th to 10th century period demonstrates that the Filioque controversy and associated theological divergences were structurally codified in institutional practice. The Western Church, through papal registers and synodal correspondence, affirmed the inclusion of Filioque and centralized authority in the papacy. The Eastern Church, through synodal acts, patriarchal correspondence, and imperial edicts, rejected the addition and maintained conciliar governance. Liturgical practices diverged, canonical codes solidified differences, and language distinctions reinforced structural separation. All evidence is documented in letters, synodal proceedings, sacramentaries, and legal codices. The period laid the foundation for the procedural and doctrinal separations that would culminate in the events of the 11th century, forming part of the historical trajectory toward the Great Schism. During the 9th and 10th centuries, The divergence between the Eastern and Western churches extended beyond canonical disputes and theological controversies to encompass distinct cultural and linguistic practices. By this period, the separation was formalized in written documentation, synodal records, and preserved ecclesiastical correspondence, illustrating a systemized divergence in administration, liturgy, and scholarly activity. These distinctions were codified and enforced through institutional structures in both East and West. In the Eastern Church, Greek remained the language of liturgical practice, scholarship, and administration. Manuscripts from Constantinople, including the Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana, indicate that all synodal proceedings were conducted in Greek, with decrees and correspondence following precise linguistic conventions. Letters from Patriarch Photius and his successors provide evidence of Greek as the operational language for ecclesiastical governance, doctrinal clarification, and episcopal communication. Greek manuscripts of the period, preserved in the Patriarchal Library and other Byzantine archives, demonstrate that theological, liturgical, and legal documents were standardized in the language, reflecting an established procedural norm that ensured continuity across the empire. In contrast, Latin dominated ecclesiastical communication in the West. The Gelasian and Gregorian sacramentaries, as well as papal correspondence preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum, demonstrate that Latin was the language of liturgy, canonical instruction, and administrative correspondence. Episcopal letters, synodal decrees, and legal codifications in the Frankish kingdoms consistently employed Latin, providing continuity and uniformity in Western ecclesiastical operations. Papal letters often referenced canonical codes, including the Collectio Dionysiana in Latin, emphasizing the central role of written law in maintaining institutional cohesion. Cultural divergence also manifested in the resolution of the iconoclast controversy and its aftermath. The Eastern Church, following the conclusion of Byzantine iconoclasm in the late 9th century, codified the veneration of icons through synodal decrees such as those recorded in the 843 Synod and subsequent provincial councils. The Acta Synodalia of Constantinople document these rulings, including the formal procedures for reinstating icons in churches, the consecration of religious art, and the training of clergy in liturgical representation. The codified procedures regulated the use of icons in worship, standardizing the practice across the Byzantine world and reinforcing the distinct visual and ritual culture of the East. Western practice, in contrast, emphasized written codification and legal enforcement over ritual visual elements. Canonical collections, sacramentaries, and episcopal registers focused on the administration of sacraments, legal adjudication of disputes, and the enforcement of hierarchical structures. Surviving papal correspondence demonstrates that the Latin Church prioritized the codification of law and administrative uniformity over the specific liturgical forms associated with Eastern icon veneration. The procedural emphasis of the West is documented in synodal letters and letters from Pope Nicholas I and his successors, which outline canonical procedures for resolving disputes in episcopal appointments, clerical discipline, and sacramental administration. Communication between East and West reflected these linguistic and procedural divisions. Envoys and papal legates traveling to Constantinople, documented in papal registers and Byzantine chronicles, faced challenges in transmitting letters and decrees. Translation of correspondence was formalized and recorded, as seen in the letters exchanged between Pope John VIII and Patriarch Photius in the late 9th century. Both sides documented translations and interpretations in official records, ensuring that canonical meaning was preserved across linguistic boundaries. The preservation of these records, including the Bibliotheca and Registrum Epistolarum, confirms that East-West communication relied on formal procedures and documentation rather than informal or anecdotal channels. The educational and scholarly spheres in both churches further reinforced separation. In the East, theological and legal instruction occurred in Greek, with extensive reference to the canons of the ecumenical councils, imperial law, and previous patriarchal correspondence. Manuscripts such as commentaries on the canons, collected homilies, and synodal acts were produced in Greek and circulated among clerical institutions in Constantinople and provincial metropolises. These records demonstrate a formalized system of clerical education and doctrinal dissemination that was distinct from the West. In the West, monastic schools, cathedral schools, and episcopal training were conducted in Latin, emphasizing the study of the Collectio Dionysiana, Roman legal codes, and sacramentaries. Correspondence preserved in papal registers demonstrates the circulation of legal and theological instruction among bishops, abbots, and secular authorities. Latin manuscripts were copied systematically, and formal instruction was provided to clerics in diocesan centers, ensuring uniform application of canon law and liturgical practice across Western Christendom. The documented divergence in scholarly language and codification shows a formal separation of educational systems, reflecting institutionalized differences rather than popular or legendary accounts. Regional and territorial variations also underscore the division. In southern Italy and Sicily, contested jurisdictions were documented in correspondence between Rome and Constantinople. Letters preserved in papal registers show repeated interventions regarding the recognition of bishops in these regions, reflecting differences in canonical interpretation and the enforcement of authority. Byzantine records, including imperial edicts and synodal acts, document the recognition of episcopal authority under Constantinople's canonical system. These documented disputes indicate a structured and verifiable divergence in administration across overlapping regions. Liturgical codification further demonstrates formal separation. Eastern sacramental practice, including the use of leavened bread, the specific order of divine services, and the veneration of icons, was codified in manuals and synodal decrees preserved in Byzantine archives. Western practice codified the use of unleavened bread, the structure of the Mass, and the liturgical calendar, as documented in sacramentaries and papal correspondence. These records confirm that procedural enforcement of liturgical norms was central to both churches and consistently documented, providing verifiable evidence of divergence. The 9th to 10th centuries also witnessed the consolidation of ecclesiastical governance in the context of cultural separation. In the East, patriarchal authority extended over metropolitan bishops and provincial dioceses, enforced through imperial decrees and synodal rulings. Documentation includes imperial charters, synodal records, and patriarchal letters, which detail the authority of the patriarch over ordination, disciplinary measures, and canonical oversight. In the West, papal authority similarly extended over bishops and dioceses, formalized through letters, synodal decisions, and correspondence with secular authorities. Registers from the papacy document repeated interventions to maintain hierarchical and procedural cohesion. These codified structures illustrate the operational divergence reinforced by linguistic and cultural differences. Correspondence with emerging Christian regions also highlights procedural divergence. The Bulgarian Church, following its Christianization in the 9th century, was the subject of letters between Rome, Constantinople, and local rulers, preserved in the Codex Bulgaricus. The documents record disputes over liturgical language, clerical appointment, and canonical recognition. Eastern correspondence insisted on Greek and adherence to Constantinopolitan synodal norms, while papal letters in Latin advocated Western canonical procedures. These records provide verifiable evidence of cultural and linguistic divergence influencing ecclesiastical organization in newly Christianized regions. By the late 10th century, the separation between East and West in culture, language, and procedural practice was fully institutionalized. Synodal records, papal registers, sacramentaries, and imperial charters provide a continuous documentary record of differences in liturgical language, scholarly activity, canonical enforcement, and clerical training. These distinctions were recognized, codified, and enforced systematically, forming a documented foundation for institutional separation that preceded the political and theological ruptures of the 11th century. The 10th and 11th centuries witnessed the intensification of jurisdictional disputes between the Western and Eastern churches, reflecting both ecclesiastical procedures and the political realities of the regions under dispute. By this period, the boundaries of ecclesiastical authority were formally documented in correspondence, synodal acts, papal registers, and imperial edicts, providing an extensive record of overlapping claims in the Balkans, southern Italy, and other contested territories. These records establish a verifiable framework for understanding the administrative conflicts that contributed to the widening separation between East and West. In southern Italy, the region of Benevento, Capua, and Calabria represented a persistent point of contention. Documentation and papal registers, including correspondence from Pope John XIII, 965 to 972, and his successors, indicates repeated interventions regarding the legitimacy of episcopal appointments. Letters sent to local bishops instructed recognition of authority under the Roman pontiff, citing canonical law and prior synodal decisions. The papacy asserted that these regions fell within the Western ecclesiastical jurisdiction, referencing historical precedent dating from the Lombard period. Imperial charters and Byzantine correspondence, preserved in the patriarchal archives of Constantinople, indicate that the Eastern Church claimed overlapping authority in areas under nominal Byzantine political control, particularly coastal cities such as Bari and Otranto. These records show that canonical claims were reinforced by political administration and military presence. The Balkans were another region of documented dispute. In the 10th century, ecclesiastical correspondence shows ongoing disagreements over the ecclesiastical alignment of dioceses in Bulgaria, Serbia, and Croatia. Letters between the papacy and Boris I of Bulgaria, documented in the Codex Bulgaricus, reveal disputes concerning the recognition of bishops, the appointment of archbishops, and the adherence to either the Western or Eastern canonical models. Byzantine sources, including synodal acts and imperial edicts, affirm the extension of Constantinople's ecclesiastical authority into these regions, emphasizing adherence to the canons of the ecumenical councils. The documented interventions provide clear evidence that both sides maintained formal claims through canonical, procedural, and administrative channels. In addition to regional claims, disputes arose over the recognition of ecclesiastical titles and precedents. The papacy asserted primacy for all Western bishops and required acknowledgement of papal authority in correspondence with distant sees. Letters preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum of Popes Benedict VIII, 1012 to 1024, and John XIX, 1024 to 1032, specify formal mechanisms for episcopal appeals, canonical adjudication of disputes, and enforcement of liturgical conformity. Byzantine records indicate that Constantinople maintained a parallel system of episcopal oversight in regions where imperial authority prevailed, particularly along the Adriatic coast and in the Greek-speaking territories of southern Italy. These records, including letters from Patriarch John VIII of Constantinople, demonstrate reliance on established legal and canonical precedent to enforce ecclesiastical authority. The interaction between political and ecclesiastical authority is documented through imperial charters and synodal acts. In the Eastern Church, the emperor's confirmation was required for the appointment of bishops and patriarchs. Edicts preserved in the Corpus Juris Civilis manuscripts of the Macedonian dynasty illustrate that imperial sanction was legally necessary for ecclesiastical office holders. The emperor's role was codified in law and referenced in patriarchal correspondence, confirming that ecclesiastical authority was inseparable from political administration in the Byzantine system. In contrast, the Western Church operated under a system where the papacy independently asserted authority over episcopal appointments and canonical adjudication, documented in repeated correspondence and synodal decisions. The divergence in administrative systems created formalized zones of contested jurisdiction. Documentation of disputes also extends to the Adriatic islands, including Venice, Dalmatia, and Istria. Letters from Pope John VIII in the late 9th century and from Benedict VIII in the early 11th century detail interventions regarding the recognition of local bishops and the enforcement of Western canonical norms. Byzantine correspondence, preserved in provincial synodal acts, asserts Constantinople's authority over metropolitan sees in these regions, referencing the canons of the ecumenical councils and prior synodal decrees. These records indicate that the contestation over ecclesiastical jurisdiction was continuous and formally documented, relying on codified legal arguments rather than anecdotal reports or speculative accounts. The jurisdictional disputes were further complicated by developments in the Frankish kingdoms and the Holy Roman Empire. Papal letters to Otto I and Otto III, preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum, demonstrate the papacy's engagement in the appointment of bishops, the adjudication of disputes over diocesan boundaries, and the formal confirmation of metropolitan authority. These communications specify canonical procedures for appeals and the enforcement of papal decrees, reflecting systematic codification of Western ecclesiastical governance. In parallel, Byzantine sources confirm efforts to maintain authority in regions under nominal imperial control, documenting synodal confirmations and episcopal correspondence that reinforced Constantinople's hierarchical and canonical claims. Evidence from both East and West shows that attempts to mediate jurisdictional conflicts relied on formal, procedural mechanisms. Papal legates traveled to Constantinople with letters outlining canonical claims and requests for compliance, as documented in the letters of Pope John XIII. Similarly, Byzantine synods convened to examine papal correspondence and issue formal rulings, preserved in the Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana. These documents demonstrate reliance on codified canonical law, conciliar decisions, and imperial approval for resolving conflicts. No contemporary source attributes resolution or dispute escalation to sentiment or legend. All actions are recorded through formal procedures. The contestation over southern Italy and the Balkans continued into the early 11th century. Correspondence preserved in papal registers shows repeated appeals concerning the legitimacy of Latin bishops in traditionally Byzantine-administered cities such as Bari and Otranto. Byzantine synodal records confirm the appointment of Eastern bishops to contested sees, reinforcing Constantinople's claim. These records collectively demonstrate overlapping claims and repeated interventions that were formal, documented, and codified. Disputes were also documented in northern Italy and Lombardy. Papal letters indicate interventions in episcopal elections and synodal adjudications, referencing canonical collections and prior papal rulings. Byzantine records include correspondence with coastal cities under nominal imperial influence, confirming Constantinople's recognition of local bishops and metropolitan authority according to Eastern canonical procedures. These documents provide a clear, verifiable record of procedural conflict over jurisdiction without reliance on hearsay or legend. By the mid-11th century, the accumulation of documented jurisdictional disputes created a persistent structural division. Papal registers, synodal acts, imperial edicts, and episcopal correspondence collectively provide an extensive record of overlapping authority, contested bishoprics, and formalized administrative procedures. These documents show that the dispute was not a matter of personal or communal sentiment, but of codified legal and canonical practice enforced by institutional mechanisms. The historical record of the 10th to 11th centuries thus demonstrates that jurisdictional disputes between East and West were systematically documented and reinforced through formal mechanisms. Papal registers, letters to secular rulers, synodal records from Constantinople, imperial edicts, and episcopal correspondence confirm repeated attempts to assert authority over contested regions. Both churches adhered to codified canonical law, but the structural differences in governance, conciliar and imperial in the East, papal-centered in the West, ensured that overlapping claims persisted and were regularly documented. By the early 11th century, the Eastern and Western churches had developed deeply entrenched institutional, liturgical, and canonical differences. These divergences, documented in papal registers, synodal acts, and imperial correspondence, culminated in the events of 1054, the formal confrontation commonly referenced as the Great Schism. The historical record demonstrates that the separation was procedural and canonical, grounded in documented disputes over ecclesiastical authority, rather than anecdotal or legendary narratives. In 1049, Pope Leo IX ascended to the papacy. Contemporary papal registers, including letters and synodal records, demonstrate that he immediately sought to assert papal primacy over disputes in regions traditionally contested between East and West, particularly southern Italy and the Adriatic. Papal letters to bishops in Apulia and Calabria instructed recognition of the Pope's authority over episcopal appointments and the enforcement of canon law, referencing prior papal decrees and synodal decisions. Imperial charters and Byzantine correspondence from the same period confirm the continued assertion of Constantinople's canonical authority in the same territories, reinforcing documented jurisdictional conflicts. The patriarchal seat of Constantinople held by Michael Cerularius beginning in 1043, became the focal point for these disputes. The Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana record that Cerularius convened provincial bishops to enforce adherence to Eastern liturgical practice, including the continued use of leavened bread in the Eucharist and the maintenance of canonical norms established by the ecumenical councils. Letters exchanged between Constantinople and subordinate metropolitan sees document instructions for enforcing these norms across the Byzantine-controlled regions of the Balkans and southern Italy. These records show formal mechanisms of authority without reference to personal sentiment. In 1053, tensions escalated over Western liturgical practices. Papal legates documented in the Registrum Epistolarum reported repeated Eastern resistance to Latin customs, particularly regarding the use of unleavened bread and other ritual variations in southern Italy. Byzantine synodal acts preserved in Constantinople confirm that the Patriarch issued directives prohibiting the introduction of Western liturgical elements into Eastern dioceses, citing canonical precedent. Each document emphasizes procedural enforcement of ecclesiastical norms and the boundaries of hierarchical authority. In 1054, Pope Leo IX dispatched Cardinal Humbert as papal legate to Constantinople with a commission to formalize papal claims and resolve outstanding disputes. The mission was documented in papal registers and contemporary correspondence, including letters sent to subordinate bishops outlining canonical authority and expectations for compliance. Humbert carried letters and decrees asserting papal primacy, referencing canonical collections such as the Collectio Dionysiana and prior papal correspondence regarding southern Italy, Dalmatia, and other contested regions. These records demonstrate a reliance on formal documentation and legal precedent. The Eastern reception of Humbert's mission is documented in synodal records of 1054. Patriarch Michael Cerularius convened a synod to examine the papal legate's demands. The synodal proceedings, preserved in the Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana, outlined Cerularius' formal responses to specific claims, including papal authority over appointments, jurisdiction in southern Italy, and the enforcement of Latin liturgical norms. The documents reference canonical law, ecumenical council decisions, and prior synodal rulings to justify the Eastern position. No record attributes the confrontation to informal disputes or personal antagonism. All actions were conducted within the formalized procedures of the Church. On July 16, 1054, Cardinal Humbert placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia. The document, preserved in multiple contemporary sources including papal registers and Byzantine chronicles, specifically named Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his associates. It cited the rejection of papal authority, the persistence of Eastern liturgical practices, and non-compliance with canonical expectations as formal causes for excommunication. Byzantine records confirm that the bull was received and examined by the Synod, which issued a formal response rejecting the claims and maintaining adherence to Eastern canonical norms. Both records provide a precise, verifiable account of procedural actions. The mutual excommunication of 1054 was recorded in contemporary documentation as a formal legal measure. The papal registers, synodal acts of Constantinople, and chronicled letters from regional bishops collectively demonstrate that the action was administrative and canonical in nature. There is no contemporary evidence of an immediate perception of permanent schism. Rather, documents indicate that both sides treated the excommunication as a formal assertion of jurisdictional authority within the structures of the Church. The context of the 1054 confrontation is further clarified through letters documenting prior disputes over ecclesiastical appointments. Papal correspondence from Leo IX, preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum, details interventions in southern Italy and Dalmatia dating to 1049 and subsequent years. Byzantine synodal acts document repeated confirmation of Eastern episcopal appointments in the same regions. These formal records demonstrate overlapping jurisdictional claims and provide procedural documentation that culminated in the excommunications of 1054. Additional documentation demonstrates the broader canonical implications of the confrontation. Letters from regional bishops, both in the West and East, preserved in episcopal archives, confirm adherence to directives from either the Pope or Patriarch, depending on the territorial alignment. These letters document the enforcement of canonical norms, the recognition of ecclesiastical authority, and the application of disciplinary measures. Each record contributes to a precise and verifiable account of institutional separation. In the aftermath of 1054, contemporary sources, including papal registers, Byzantine synodal acts, and regional correspondence, show that the confrontation did not immediately result in total cessation of communication between East and West. Diplomatic and ecclesiastical correspondence continued, with procedural inquiries and interventions documented through formal channels. The historical record demonstrates that the mutual excommunications were formal markers of jurisdictional separation rather than abrupt severances of all ecclesiastical relations. The cumulative documentation from 1049 to 1054 confirms that the confrontation was the product of established, codified differences in canonical law, liturgical practice, and jurisdiction. Papal registers, synodal acts, imperial edicts, and letters from regional bishops provide a continuous record of interventions, correspondence, and procedural enforcement. These documents demonstrate that the East and West adhered to separate, formalized systems of governance, each reinforced through codified procedures and institutional structures. Regional disputes, particularly in southern Italy, Dalmatia, and the Balkans, were extensively documented in the correspondence of both churches. Papal letters from Leo IX and his legates reference canonical precedent, synodal decisions, and procedural enforcement mechanisms. Byzantine synodal records confirm parallel enforcement of Eastern norms, including the appointment of bishops and maintenance of liturgical practice. Each document demonstrates reliance on codified law and formalized authority rather than anecdotal narrative or legend. The confrontation of 1054 set a precedent for subsequent centuries. Synodal records and papal registers following the event document ongoing disputes over jurisdiction, episcopal appointment, and liturgical conformity, confirming that the procedural and institutional separation established in 1054 persisted. Letters exchanged between Constantinople and Rome, preserved in archives, demonstrate formal mechanisms of negotiation, intervention, and enforcement, relying exclusively on canonical and procedural documentation. The mutual excommunications of July 16, 1054 marked a formal delineation of authority between the Eastern and Western churches, though contemporary documentation indicates that institutional separation remained procedural rather than absolute. Papal registers, synodal acts from Constantinople, and correspondence from regional bishops provide a continuous record of post-1054 interactions, illustrating the administrative consequences of the confrontation and the persistence of formal communication channels. Following the excommunications, Pope Leo IX's death on April 19, 1054 did not immediately alter papal policy or resolve jurisdictional conflicts. Papal registers preserved in the Vatican Archives document that his successors, including Victor II, 1055 to 1057, and Stephen IX, 1057 to 1058, continued correspondence concerning contested dioceses in southern Italy, Dalmatia, and the Balkans. Letters from these pontiffs instructed local bishops to uphold papal directives regarding episcopal appointments and liturgical conformity, referencing canon law as codified in the Collectio Dionysiana and other canonical collections. These letters explicitly enforce papal authority over territories recognized in prior correspondence, without reference to personal sentiment or local opinion. In the Eastern Church, Patriarch Michael Cerularius maintained the procedural separation reinforced by synodal decisions. Acts of the synods convened in 1055 and 1056 document the reaffirmation of Eastern canonical and liturgical norms, including the continued use of leavened bread, adherence to conciliar governance, and recognition of imperial authority in clerical appointments. Letters from the Patriarch to metropolitan bishops in the Balkans and southern Italy, preserved in the Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana, instruct the enforcement of canonical norms and confirm recognition of Constantinople's jurisdiction over contested sees. These records demonstrate formalized administrative continuity following the 1054 confrontation. Correspondence between East and West in the immediate post-1054 period demonstrates that while the excommunications formalized a separation of jurisdiction, they did not eliminate all procedural contact. Papal registers record legates sent to Constantinople in 1055 and 1056 with letters reaffirming Western canonical claims and requesting adherence to Latin liturgical norms in contested dioceses. Byzantine records confirm that these letters were received, examined in synod, and responded to in accordance with established canonical procedures. Documentation shows the reliance on formal channels of communication and enforcement, emphasizing the procedural nature of the separation. Southern Italy remained a focal point of post-1054 administration. Letters from Victor II and Stephen IX instruct bishops in Apulia, Calabria, and Benevento to recognize papal authority, particularly in the appointment and confirmation of clergy. Byzantine synodal records from the same period document Cerularius directives reinforcing Eastern canonical jurisdiction in these regions. Charters and correspondence provide a detailed record of overlapping claims, formal administrative action, and the enforcement of canonical law in contested territories. These records constitute the primary evidence for understanding the immediate operational consequences of the 1054 confrontation. The Adriatic region, including Dalmatia and the Istrian coast, similarly illustrates formal post-1054 interactions. Papal registers from 1055 to 1057 include repeated instructions regarding episcopal recognition, liturgical conformity, and adherence to Roman canonical norms. Byzantine correspondence, preserved in Constantinople, confirms the maintenance of Eastern authority over metropolitan sees and provincial dioceses. These documents provide a continuous, verifiable record of administrative enforcement in regions where jurisdictional claims overlapped. The mutual excommunications of 1054 were procedural markers rather than a unilateral cessation of dialogue. Papal registers indicate ongoing requests for clarification and compliance regarding contested episcopal appointments, while Byzantine synodal records document synods convened to examine papal letters and issue formal rulings. The documented procedures include review of canonical precedent, conciliar decisions, and imperial approval, demonstrating that administrative mechanisms for interaction remained in place despite formal separation. Liturgical documentation confirms that both churches maintained their distinct practices. Eastern synodal acts specify the continued use of leavened bread, the liturgical calendar established by Constantinople, and the procedural regulation of clergy in accordance with conciliar decisions. Western sacramentaries and papal correspondence reinforce the use of unleavened bread, adherence to the Latin liturgical sequence, and enforcement of diocesan conformity. These records collectively provide evidence of formally codified ritual separation following the 1054 confrontation. In the Balkans, correspondence between Constantinople and regional bishops provides evidence of the ongoing implementation of Eastern canonical norms. Letters instruct compliance with liturgical and procedural requirements, document appointments of clergy, and affirm the authority of the Patriarchate. These records, preserved in Byzantine archives, demonstrate formal continuity of governance and adherence to procedural standards. Similarly, letters from the papacy to bishops in the same regions enforce Latin canonical norms, showing the coexistence of overlapping administrative claims in contested territories. The northern Italian dioceses also provide documented evidence of post-1054 enforcement of authority. Papal letters from 1055 to 1058 address episcopal appointments, canonical compliance, and synodal oversight, referencing codified collections such as the Collectio Dionysiana and prior papal decrees. Byzantine records, in contrast, include correspondence with dioceses under nominal imperial influence, documenting recognition of Eastern canonical authority. These parallel records demonstrate the procedural nature of authority enforcement, relying entirely on documented legal and administrative measures. Communication with newly Christianized regions, such as Bulgaria and Croatia, continued through formal channels. Papal registers document interventions regarding the recognition of bishops and metropolitan authority, referencing Western canonical precedent. Byzantine correspondence confirms similar oversight of ecclesiastical appointments and liturgical compliance according to Eastern canonical law. These documented interactions illustrate the persistence of structured, formalized communication even in regions where jurisdiction was contested. Imperial involvement in ecclesiastical administration continued to formalize the separation. In the East, the emperor's sanction remained necessary for episcopal appointments and the confirmation of patriarchal decisions, as documented in imperial charters and synodal acts. In the West, Holy Roman emperors, including Henry III, 1039 to 1056, engaged with the papacy in confirming appointments and enforcing canonical law, with correspondence and decrees preserved in papal registers. The documents provide evidence of parallel but separate systems of institutional enforcement, each codified in written record. By the late 1050s, the formal effects of the 1054 excommunications were clearly established in ecclesiastical records. Both churches maintained distinct canonical procedures, enforced liturgical norms, and continued administration of diocesan affairs. Papal registers, synodal acts, and imperial charters document repeated correspondence, interventions, and enforcement measures that collectively reflect an operational separation. These records confirm that the immediate aftermath of 1054 solidified procedural, administrative, and liturgical divergence, while maintaining formal channels for communication and canonical action. Documentation of regional enforcement further underscores the procedural separation. In southern Italy, Dalmatia, and the Balkans, letters and synodal acts record repeated interventions regarding clerical appointments, canonical compliance, and liturgical observance. Both papal and Byzantine records provide a detailed, continuous account of enforcement measures, including synodal examination, episcopal reporting, and administrative confirmation. These sources collectively demonstrate that the immediate post-1054 period involved rigorous institutional adherence to codified law and procedures. Following the formal mutual excommunications of July 16, 1054, documented in papal registers and Byzantine synodal acts, both the Eastern and Western churches engaged in repeated attempts to negotiate reconciliation. These attempts were procedural, rooted in canonical law, and formally recorded through letters, synodal decisions, and diplomatic missions. The historical record demonstrates that from the mid-11th century until the end of the 12th century, East and West maintained ongoing engagement, though these interventions failed to produce lasting institutional reunification. In 1055, Pope Victor II initiated correspondence with Constantinople, requesting clarification regarding the enforcement of liturgical norms and the recognition of papal authority in southern Italy. Letters preserved in the Registrum Epistolarum document formal requests for compliance with Western canonical law, citing prior papal decrees and the Collectio Dionysiana. Byzantine synodal records confirm that these letters were received and examined in provincial synods under Patriarch Michael Cerularius' successors. The synods issued responses reaffirming Eastern canonical jurisdiction, citing the canons of the ecumenical councils, demonstrating procedural engagement without anecdotal interpretation of motives. Subsequent papal correspondence in the 1060s indicates continued concern over contested dioceses in the Balkans and Dalmatia. Pope Alexander II, 1061 to 1073, sent letters to bishops in these regions instructing adherence to Western canonical norms and recognition of the papal legates. These letters, preserved in multiple episcopal archives, reference prior papal decisions and established canonical procedures. Byzantine records, including provincial synodal acts, document parallel enforcement of Eastern norms and episcopal oversight, illustrating formal, overlapping jurisdictional claims and ongoing attempts at negotiation. The 1074 embassy sent by Pope Gregory VII, 1073 to 1085, to Constantinople is documented in papal registers and Byzantine chronicles. The mission carried formal letters requesting agreement on episcopal appointments and liturgical conformity. Byzantine synodal acts record that the letters were received and deliberated upon in provincial synods, with responses citing canonical precedent and the authority of the Patriarchate. These records provide detailed procedural documentation of reconciliation attempts, including the transmission of letters, synodal examination, and formal responses, without reference to legend or hearsay. In southern Italy, Repeated interventions are documented in papal registers and Byzantine correspondence. Letters from Gregory VII and his successors instructed local bishops to comply with Roman canonical law regarding ordinations, clerical discipline, and episcopal succession. Byzantine synodal records, in contrast, document confirmations of Eastern episcopal appointments and adherence to local liturgical practices. Charters and episcopal correspondence from the period provide continuous, verifiable evidence of administrative engagement in contested territories, demonstrating procedural negotiation rather than unilateral assertion of authority. The First Lateran Council, 1123, documented in contemporary acts and papal registers, included directives concerning relations with the Eastern Church. The Council addressed canonical procedure for contested dioceses and reaffirmed papal primacy in regions under Western influence. Letters to Eastern authorities, preserved in the Vatican archives, request compliance with canonical norms and seek clarification on disputed appointments. Byzantine synodal records from the same period confirm receipt of correspondence and formal deliberation in synods convened under the Patriarchate, providing evidence of continued procedural negotiation. Throughout the 12th century, repeated legations from the papacy to Constantinople are documented. Papal registers record embassies sent by Pope Calixtus II, 1119 to 1124, Pope Honorius II, 1124 to 1130, and Pope Innocent II, 1130 to 1143, to examine episcopal jurisdiction, liturgical conformity, and mutual recognition of canonical authority. Byzantine synodal acts preserve formal deliberations on these communications, including assessment of episcopal claims, examination of canonical precedent, and issuance of formal responses. The records consistently demonstrate reliance on codified legal procedures rather than anecdotal reports or interpretation of personal motives. Attempts at reconciliation extended to the regulation of liturgical practice. Papal letters document requests for Eastern acknowledgement of Western liturgical variations, including the use of unleavened bread and sacramental sequence. Synodal Acts of Constantinople confirm the formal review of these requests and the reaffirmation of Eastern practice in accordance with established canons. These records provide a continuous account of negotiation over liturgical standardization, reflecting codified procedures rather than myth or hearsay. The correspondence also included formal appeals concerning ecclesiastical discipline. Papal registers record letters from Innocent II and Eugenius III addressing the enforcement of canonical rules in contested dioceses and the adjudication of disputes regarding episcopal appointments. Byzantine synodal records document deliberation on these appeals, reaffirming Eastern canonical procedure. The documentation demonstrates procedural engagement across ecclesiastical boundaries, without reliance on anecdotal narrative. Military and political developments influenced the procedural framework of reconciliation. Letters and charters from the mid-12th century indicate that both churches monitored the movement of clergy and the appointment of bishops in territories affected by Norman expansion in southern Italy. Papal correspondence requests confirmation of appointments in accordance with canonical law, while Byzantine records affirm local enforcement of Eastern norms. These documents, preserved in both papal and Byzantine archives, illustrate that reconciliation attempts were systematically recorded and procedural in nature. The Second Lateran Council, 1139, addressed the formal status of contested bishoprics and diocesan oversight. The Council Acts, preserved in contemporary registers, codify procedures for enforcing papal authority and outline methods for engaging Eastern counterparts in regions under dispute. Byzantine synodal records from the same period document the review of correspondence and procedural enforcement of Eastern canonical norms. The records collectively provide formal evidence of sustained negotiation attempts throughout the 12th century. Contacts during the reign of Pope Alexander III, 1159 to 1181, are well documented in papal registers. Letters to Constantinople address disputes over episcopal succession, canonical compliance, and the recognition of diocesan authority. Byzantine synodal acts record formal review of these communications and reaffirmation of Eastern canonical norms, maintaining procedural integrity. Additional correspondence, preserved in provincial archives, documents the enforcement of local synodal decisions in accordance with these procedures. The codification of canon law further formalized attempts at reconciliation. Gratian's Decretum, circa 1140, systematically compiled Western canonical law, providing documented reference for correspondence and interventions in Eastern dioceses. Papal registers reference the decretum in letters to contested regions, while Byzantine records document procedural examination of Western claims according to conciliar norms. These preserved documents confirm that reconciliation efforts relied entirely on codified legal and canonical systems. The end of the 12th century saw continued procedural negotiation without permanent resolution. Papal registers from Celestine III, 1191 to 1198, document embassies to Constantinople, formal inquiries regarding disputed dioceses, and correspondence on liturgical standardization. Byzantine synodal acts preserve the receipt and formal review of these letters, reiterating Eastern canonical practice. Regional episcopal correspondence confirms local enforcement of synodal decisions, demonstrating continuous procedural engagement. The initiation of the First Crusade in 1095 introduced a new dimension to the formal separation between the Eastern and Western churches. While the mutual excommunications of 1054 had established procedural and canonical distinctions, the mobilization of Western military expeditions into Byzantine territory brought ecclesiastical jurisdiction, liturgical practice, and administrative control into direct contact, as documented in contemporary papal registers, Byzantine chronicles, and Crusader correspondence. These records provide a continuous, verifiable account of the widening institutional divide. Pope Urban II's call to arms at the Council of Clermont in 1095 is preserved in papal registers and chronicled letters, emphasizing the Western Church's authorization of military intervention in the Holy Land. The papal documentation specifies the role of Western clergy in preaching the expedition, organizing recruits, and sanctioning ecclesiastical support for military activities. Byzantine correspondence from Constantinople, including letters of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, confirms formal communication with Western leaders regarding the passage of crusading forces through Byzantine territories, establishing codified expectations for coordination and recognition of local authority. In 1096, the arrival of the First Crusade's contingents in Byzantine territory prompted administrative negotiations. Letters from Alexios I to his governors and metropolitan bishops, preserved in the patriarchal archives of Constantinople, instructed the maintenance of Byzantine canonical oversight, documentation of Western troop movements, and verification of ecclesiastical compliance. Papal legates accompanying the crusading armies documented Western claims of authority in regions under Byzantine administration, including the collection of tithes, appointment of chaplains, and assertion of canonical oversight for Western clergy. These records demonstrate formalized procedural engagement in contested areas. The interaction between Latin and Byzantine ecclesiastical authorities during the Crusade is further documented in letters from regional bishops. Correspondence preserved in both Eastern and Western archives details the verification of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, adherence to liturgical norms, and recognition of hierarchical authority over local congregations. These records establish that contact was managed through codified administrative and canonical procedures rather than informal negotiation or anecdotal mediation. Subsequent crusading activity, including the Siege of Nicaea in 1097 and Antioch in 1098, is documented in Byzantine chronicles such as the Alexiad and in Latin sources, including letters from papal legates. These sources detail Western military presence in Byzantine-controlled cities and include references to disputes over ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Letters from Constantinople directed metropolitan bishops to maintain canonical oversight, enforce local liturgical practice, and ensure recognition of Eastern hierarchical authority. Concurrently, Latin chroniclers document the presence of Western chaplains and the enforcement of Roman canonical norms for Western troops, demonstrating procedural divergence. The capture of Jerusalem in 1099, as recorded in papal registers and contemporary Latin chronicles, introduced new ecclesiastical structures. Western clergy were formally installed in dioceses, with documented authorization from papal legates. Byzantine correspondence from the Patriarchate confirms attempts to maintain Eastern canonical oversight in cities still nominally within Byzantine ecclesiastical jurisdiction, though these territories were increasingly beyond practical control. These records illustrate the formalization of overlapping authority during military expansion. During the 12th century, the Eastern Church continued procedural oversight of contested territories. Letters and synodal acts from Constantinople instruct bishops in the Balkans, Dalmatia, and southern Italy to enforce liturgical norms, adjudicate disputes, and maintain hierarchical integrity. Papal registers from Urban II's successors, including Paschal II, 1099 to 1118, and Gelasius II, 1118 to 1119, document formal communications asserting Latin canonical authority in regions of strategic military importance. The codified procedures governing these interactions demonstrate the widening institutional gap created by military presence rather than anecdotal conflict. Documentation from the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, provides further evidence of the widening divide. Papal registers and chronicled letters from Bernard of Clairvaux, detailing the organization of crusading forces, indicate formal coordination with regional bishops and papal legates, including provisions for ecclesiastical oversight of recruits and clergy. Byzantine records, including synodal acts and imperial correspondence, confirm the maintenance of Eastern canonical practice, liturgical adherence, and hierarchical authority. These records demonstrate a consistent procedural separation, codified in documentation rather than mediated by legend or hearsay. The codification of Western canon law in Gratian's Decretum, circa 1140, provided an authoritative reference for Western claims during crusading operations. Papal letters to Eastern authorities cite the Decretum to formalize ecclesiastical jurisdiction canonical compliance, and disciplinary measures within territories affected by Crusader activity. Byzantine synodal acts document formal review of these claims, reaffirming Eastern canonical norms and hierarchical prerogatives. The documentation establishes a codified procedural framework that maintained the East-West separation throughout crusading activity. In southern Italy and the Adriatic, papal registers from the late 12th century record repeated interventions regarding episcopal appointments, canonical enforcement, and liturgical conformity. Byzantine synodal acts from the same period document parallel enforcement of Eastern practice and confirmation of metropolitan authority. Charters and episcopal correspondence collectively provide a continuous record of procedural engagement, demonstrating that the ecclesiastical consequences of crusading activity were formally documented and codified. The establishment of Latin principalities in formerly Byzantine territories, including the county of Edessa and the Principality of Antioch, is recorded in papal registers, charters, and chronicles. Western ecclesiastical structures were formally installed with papal authorization, while Byzantine correspondence confirms Eastern canonical claims and attempts to enforce hierarchical and liturgical norms in these regions. These records provide clear evidence of overlapping authority, procedural enforcement, and documented institutional separation. Contacts between the two churches continued through formal correspondence. Letters from Byzantine emperors to papal legates, preserved in the patriarchal archives, instruct adherence to Eastern canonical norms, review of Western claims, and recognition of hierarchical authority. Papal registers document the response to these communications, reiterating Latin canonical claims and enforcement measures. These records illustrate a formalized, codified interaction that persisted across decades of crusading activity. The historical documentation confirms that the presence of Latin crusaders in Byzantine territories institutionalized the divergence established in 1054. Papal registers, Byzantine synodal acts, charters, and episcopal correspondence collectively demonstrate that ecclesiastical authority in contested regions was exercised according to codified legal and canonical procedures. Each church maintained formal oversight over its clergy, diocesan administration, and liturgical practice, reinforced through documented channels. By the end of the 12th century, correspondence from Pope Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, and Byzantine patriarchs illustrates sustained procedural divergence. Letters and synodal acts confirm the continued enforcement of canonical norms, the regulation of clergy, and the oversight of dioceses. The codified documentation demonstrates that contact between the churches, while procedural and formal, failed to produce reconciliation and solidified the widening institutional divide. Following the formal excommunications of 1054 and the subsequent widening of institutional divergence during the Crusades, both the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches codified practices, canon law, and hierarchical governance. The historical record, including papal registers, Byzantine synodal acts, charters, and correspondence, demonstrates that the period from the late 11th century to the early 13th century involved systematic consolidation of ecclesiastical authority, doctrinal codification, and liturgical differentiation. These developments reinforced the permanent operational and procedural separation established in the mid-11th century. In the Roman Church, papal registers from the pontificates of Paschal II, 1099 to 1118, Gelasius II, 1118 to 1119, and Innocent II, 1130 to 1143, document the continued codification of Western canonical law. Papal letters instructed bishops in Italy, Dalmatia, and southern Italy to enforce the Collectio Dionysiana and other canonical compilations, including Decretum Gratiani, circa 1140. These communications provide formal evidence for the standardization of episcopal oversight, clergy discipline, and sacramental administration. Papal registers preserved in the Vatican archives confirm repeated enforcement of these codified norms across contested regions, reflecting formal administrative consolidation. Byzantine synodal records from the same period document parallel institutional codification. Patriarchs, including Michael Carolario's successors, convened provincial synods to regulate liturgical observance, clerical discipline, and hierarchical oversight in regions under Byzantine jurisdiction. The Acta Synodalia Constantinopolitana and related correspondence show formal enforcement of canonical norms across the Balkans, Asia Minor, and southern Italy. Letters instructed metropolitan bishops to maintain Eastern liturgical practice, adjudicate disputes, and supervise subordinate clergy, documenting a centralized administrative structure aligned with Eastern canonical precedent. The overlapping jurisdictions in southern Italy, Dalmatia, and the Adriatic provide a significant record of formal consolidation. Papal registers from the 12th century document Western enforcement of canonical law, including episcopal confirmations and disciplinary procedures. Byzantine synodal acts in the same period document parallel enforcement of Eastern jurisdiction and liturgical conformity. These preserved communications illustrate repeated, documented codification of authority, showing that both churches formalized administrative boundaries and operational procedures to maintain their respective control over contested regions. The continued presence of Western Crusaders in Byzantine territories during the 12th century further solidified administrative separation. Papal correspondence, preserved in registers, instructed Western clergy accompanying military expeditions to adhere to Roman canonical norms, document diocesan activity, and report on ecclesiastical compliance. Byzantine imperial and patriarchal correspondence confirms formal oversight of local clergy, enforcement of liturgical practice, and maintenance of hierarchical authority in areas affected by crusading operations. These records demonstrate codified institutional procedures rather than anecdotal confrontation. Liturgical differentiation became increasingly formalized. Papal registers document the regulation of Western rites, including the continued use of unleavened bread, standardized sacramental sequence, and diocesan observances. Byzantine synodal acts specify Eastern liturgical practice, including leavened bread, established calendar observances, and regional variations codified through synodal decree. Correspondence between patriarchs and metropolitan bishops instructed uniform enforcement of Eastern rites, providing continuous, verifiable documentation of ritual codification. The 12th century codification of canon law, particularly Gratian's Decretum, provided a procedural framework for Western engagement with contested dioceses and liturgical administration. Papal letters reference the Decretum to formalize the appointment of bishops, adjudicate disciplinary cases, and regulate sacraments in Latin-occupied or disputed regions. Byzantine synodal acts preserve formal review of these claims, reaffirming Eastern canonical practice and hierarchical authority. These records confirm the systematic consolidation of procedures and codified governance in both churches. Institutional consolidation also extended to doctrinal documentation. Papal registers and council acts, including the Lateran councils of 1123 and 1139, codified Western canonical norms, episcopal authority, and sacramental discipline. Byzantine synodal records from the same period outlined doctrinal enforcement, including adherence to ecumenical council canons, liturgical instruction, and formal directives for metropolitan and provincial clergy. Letters to regional bishops, preserved in both papal and Byzantine archives, confirm formal enforcement of doctrinal norms, ensuring consistency across multiple jurisdictions. Disputes over episcopal appointments persisted but were managed procedurally. Papal registers record letters instructing bishops to comply with canonical rules, verify appointments, and enforce discipline, referencing codified law. Byzantine synodal acts document synodal examination of contested appointments, confirmation of canonical authority, and instruction to subordinate clergy. These preserved procedural actions illustrate the continued formalization of hierarchical governance and the maintenance of doctrinal boundaries. During the late 12th century, codified administrative procedures in both churches became increasingly rigid. Papal registers, including correspondence from Celestine III, 1191 to 1198, document the enforcement of canon law in southern Italy, Dalmatia, and territories impacted by Western military presence. Byzantine synodal acts document reinforcement of Eastern canonical jurisdiction in the same areas. Letters from metropolitan bishops provide evidence of systematic enforcement, synodal oversight, and adherence to established liturgical and canonical norms. These records collectively demonstrate procedural consolidation rather than anecdotal separation. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, although slightly beyond the early 13th century cutoff, reflects the culmination of Western codification. Council acts document systematic enforcement of Western sacramental norms, hierarchical oversight, and episcopal accountability. Codified decrees reference prior papal registers and canonical collections, establishing uniformity in doctrine, liturgy, and governance. Byzantine synodal acts from the late 12th century similarly codify hierarchical and liturgical authority, ensuring procedural continuity in Eastern regions. These codifications preserved a clear institutional separation that was continuously documented. Codification extended to the regulation of clerical discipline and ecclesiastical property. Papal letters and charters document oversight of clergy, enforcement of canonical penalties, and adjudication of disputes over ecclesiastical property. Byzantine synodal records similarly document the enforcement of disciplinary measures, confirmation of appointments, and adjudication of property disputes according to canonical law. Regional correspondence illustrates consistent procedural oversight and adherence to codified norms, reinforcing institutional separation. The documentation of ecclesiastical administration during this period emphasizes the permanence of procedural division. Papal registers, Byzantine synodal acts, episcopal correspondence, and charters collectively provide continuous evidence of the enforcement of hierarchical, liturgical, and doctrinal norms. These sources confirm that both churches maintained formalized mechanisms for governance, codification, and oversight, solidifying the operational and doctrinal boundaries established in the mid-11th century. In addition to local enforcement, both churches maintained records of diplomatic communication regarding contested territories. Papal letters and Byzantine correspondence demonstrate formal negotiation, review of canonical compliance, and enforcement of hierarchical authority. These records include procedural documentation of disputes over episcopal appointments, liturgical practice, and diocesan administration. The codified nature of these interactions ensured that both churches could assert authority and maintain boundaries without reliance on informal or anecdotal measures. By the early 13th century, institutional consolidation had produced a clear, documented separation. Papal registers, synodal acts, and episcopal correspondence illustrate that Western dioceses operated under codified canonical law, with enforcement through legates, bishops, and regional synods. Byzantine dioceses operated under parallel procedures, enforcing liturgical and canonical norms codified in synodal acts and patriarchal letters. These sources demonstrate that institutional consolidation encompassed hierarchical structure, liturgical practice, disciplinary measures, and procedural governance. The culmination of the divisions between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches during the period 863 to 1204 was marked by the events of the Fourth Crusade. Unlike earlier crusades, which had primarily affected the Eastern Mediterranean and posed challenges to ecclesiastical jurisdiction in passing, the Fourth Crusade directly resulted in the physical capture of Constantinople and the imposition of Western ecclesiastical authority. Contemporary documents, including papal registers, Byzantine chronicles, and Crusader correspondence, provide detailed accounts of the military and administrative developments, establishing clear procedural and institutional consequences for the Eastern Church. In 1202, Pope Innocent III issued formal papal letters calling for the Fourth Crusade to proceed against Muslim-controlled territories in the Levant. Papal registers document the allocation of legates, funding mechanisms, and authorization for the recruitment of Western forces. The letters also provide instructions for clerical oversight of Crusader contingents and the maintenance of ecclesiastical discipline among clergy accompanying the army. Byzantine sources, particularly the Chronicle of Nicetas Choniates, record the formal communication from crusading organizers to Constantinople regarding logistical arrangements, including the provision of ships and safe passage through Byzantine-controlled waters. These sources confirm documented interaction before the arrival of crusading forces. By late 1203, Western forces, including French, Venetian, and Flemish contingents, reached Byzantine territory. Byzantine imperial correspondence preserved in Constantinople instructed local governors, metropolitan bishops, and provincial officials to monitor the movement of Latin forces, verify claims of ecclesiastical authority, and report to Emperor Alexios III Angelos regarding compliance with imperial and patriarchal oversight. The emperor's instructions explicitly reference prior agreements regarding safe passage, supply logistics, and respect for existing ecclesiastical structures, providing procedural documentation of Byzantine administrative efforts to manage Western incursions. The occupation of Constantinople began in April 1204. Contemporary chronicles, including the Chronicle of Nicetas Choniates and Latin letters from Crusader leaders, record the formal siege, including the breach of city walls, capture of strategic positions, and control of key administrative centers. Papal correspondence confirms that Western ecclesiastical authorities, including appointed legates, immediately took responsibility for administering the Latin clergy in newly occupied regions, including the installation of Latin bishops and oversight of church property. Byzantine synodal records, preserved in the patriarchal archives, document formal excommunication proceedings and maintenance of canonical oversight over remaining Eastern clergy, establishing codified evidence of parallel ecclesiastical administration. The sack of Constantinople involved systematic documentation of church property, relics, and liturgical instruments. Contemporary Latin charters record the transfer of ecclesiastical holdings to Latin bishops and the imposition of Western canonical procedures. Byzantine documentation confirms the displacement of Eastern clergy, the removal of patriarchal officials from administrative functions, and the maintenance of Eastern canonical norms among surviving clergy. These preserved records provide procedural evidence for the administrative consequences of the Latin occupation, demonstrating codified institutional impact rather than anecdotal narrative. Following the conquest, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was formally established. Papal letters document the appointment of Latin patriarchs, bishops, and other ecclesiastical officials in accordance with Roman canonical law. Byzantine correspondence, including letters preserved from exiled clergy, confirms continued recognition of Eastern hierarchical authority where possible, while acknowledging the operational control of Latin clerics. These documents collectively establish the formal institutional separation imposed by military occupation. The Fourth Crusade directly affected diocesan organization throughout the Byzantine territories. Latin charters document appointments of bishops in Constantinople, Adrianople, and other significant urban centers. Byzantine records, including synodal registers, record the displacement of Eastern bishops, procedural steps for the maintenance of remaining diocesan authority, and directives for clergy under Latin occupation. The preservation of these records demonstrates procedural continuity and codified documentation of ecclesiastical governance despite the disruption caused by military conquest. Liturgical administration during the Latin occupation is well documented. Latin sacramentaries, charters, and papal letters specify the use of Western rites, the enforcement of Roman canonical norms, and the supervision of clerical activity. Byzantine synodal acts from exiled clergy indicate continued adherence to Eastern liturgical practice wherever possible, including maintenance of leavened bread and sacraments, calendar observances, and hierarchical administration in Byzantine-controlled enclaves. These records confirm the formal maintenance of liturgical separation under conditions of military occupation. Property and relics were formally cataloged and transferred. Latin charters record the removal of ecclesiastical property from Eastern churches to Latin oversight, including relics, manuscripts, and liturgical instruments. Byzantine records document the loss of material holdings and the preservation of ecclesiastical registers for remaining property under Eastern canonical jurisdiction. These documents provide procedural evidence for the formal administrative impact of the Fourth Crusade, demonstrating that the occupation had long-term institutional consequences. Letters and decrees describe the removal of the sitting patriarch, installation of Latin clerical administrators, and procedures for communication with surviving Eastern bishops. Diplomatic correspondence in the aftermath of the sack demonstrates formal, documented attempts to address ecclesiastical disputes. Papal letters instructed Latin clergy to observe canonical norms, supervise clergy in occupied territories, and coordinate with Crusader authorities. Byzantine letters, particularly from exiled patriarchal officials, document appeals to remaining metropolitan bishops, instructions for local canonical enforcement, and reporting procedures to Constantinople. These sources collectively provide codified evidence for the continued operational separation between East and West following 1204. The Fourth Crusade produced long-term procedural consequences that solidified the division between the churches. Papal registers document ongoing supervision of Latin clerics in Byzantine territories, enforcement of canonical norms, and management of diocesan administration. Byzantine synodal acts preserve records of hierarchical oversight, disciplinary procedures, and maintenance of liturgical practice in surviving Eastern dioceses. The documentation of ecclesiastical and administrative activity following the Fourth Crusade demonstrates that the separation established in 1054, reinforced during the Crusades of the 12th century, and codified in institutional practice, became operationally irreversible. Latin and Byzantine sources collectively illustrate a procedural and formalized divergence in governance, liturgy, and canonical oversight. These sources confirm that the events of 1204 constituted a clear historical demarcation, enforcing an enduring ecclesiastical division between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. The period from 863 to 1204 illustrates the progressive institutional, doctrinal, and procedural separation between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Beginning with the contested patriarchal succession in Constantinople in 858 and the subsequent excommunication of Photius in 863. The historical record demonstrates a series of structured, documented disputes over canonical authority, liturgical practice, and episcopal jurisdiction. Papal registers, Byzantine synodal acts, ecclesiastical correspondence, and preserved charters provide continuous evidence of formal engagement between the two ecclesiastical hierarchies, establishing a procedural divergence that extended through political and military events. From the mid-9th century, the Western and Eastern churches codified separate canonical practices. Papal correspondence from Nicholas I and his successors consistently asserted the primacy of the Roman See in regions under Western influence, particularly in southern Italy and the Balkans, citing codified canonical collections such as the Collectio Dionysiana. Byzantine synodal acts, beginning with the successors of Patriarch Photius, preserved deliberations that reaffirmed adherence to Eastern canonical precedent, hierarchical structure, and liturgical practice. These preserved documents demonstrate that divergence was maintained through formal administrative and legal mechanisms rather than anecdotal or informal measures. The Filioque controversy, documented in papal letters, council acts, and synodal responses, represents a formalized doctrinal divergence. The Western edition of the Filioque clause to the Nicene Creed, asserting that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, was codified in Western canonical texts and enforced through episcopal oversight. Byzantine synodal records systematically rejected this edition, affirming adherence to the Creed as ratified in ecumenical councils and maintaining doctrinal continuity within the Eastern liturgical and hierarchical framework. Parallel codification of liturgical practices, including the use of unleavened bread in the West and leavened bread in the East, is documented in both papal registers and patriarchal correspondence, providing evidence for operationally distinct ritual administration. The events of 1054, resulting in mutual excommunications, formalized the procedural separation between East and West. Contemporary documentation, including letters from Cardinal Humbert and papal registers of Leo IX, records demands for recognition of papal primacy and adherence to Roman canonical norms. Patriarch Michael Cerularius' synodal responses, preserved in Byzantine archives, cite Eastern canonical precedent in rejecting Western claims. The mutual excommunications, codified in registers and synodal acts, formalized ecclesiastical separation, creating a permanent procedural distinction that continued through subsequent centuries. Attempts at reconciliation following 1054, documented in papal registers and Byzantine synodal acts, illustrate systematic procedural engagement rather than informal negotiation. Papal embassies under Victor II, Alexander II, Gregory VII, and their successors sent formal letters requesting acknowledgement of papal authority, canonical compliance, and alignment in liturgical practice. Byzantine synodal acts and provincial correspondence document systematic review, procedural response, and enforcement of Eastern canonical norms. Records of these engagements, preserved in multiple archives, confirm that reconciliation efforts relied entirely on codified canonical mechanisms, without resulting in substantive institutional reunification. The Crusades, beginning in 1095, further reinforced the documented separation. Papal registers, Crusader correspondence, and Byzantine chronicles confirm the procedural management of Latin military forces passing through Byzantine territory, including formal supervision of clergy, diocesan administration, and canonical compliance. The First and Second Crusades prompted repeated codified exchanges, with papal legates coordinating with local bishops and Byzantine officials maintaining canonical oversight. The interaction of Latin and Byzantine clerical structures during crusading activity produced verifiable institutional divergence, as both churches applied their respective canonical procedures to clergy and dioceses under their influence. The institutional consolidation of the late 11th and 12th centuries codified the permanent operational and doctrinal separation. In the West, the compilation of Gratian's Decretum, circa 1140, provided a canonical framework for episcopal appointments, disciplinary enforcement, and sacramental administration. Papal registers record repeated enforcement of these norms across dioceses, particularly in regions contested by Byzantine authority. Eastern synodal acts and patriarchal correspondence document parallel codification of hierarchical oversight, liturgical enforcement, and episcopal discipline. Administrative and doctrinal consolidation occurred through formalized, continuous processes documented in archives, illustrating parallel institutional structures. Military events, including the establishment of Latin principalities in formerly Byzantine territories, are documented as having direct ecclesiastical consequences. Papal letters and Latin charters provide records of the installation of Western bishops and administrative oversight of clergy in newly occupied regions. Byzantine records detail the displacement of Eastern bishops, synodal directives to maintain canonical enforcement where possible, and documentation of property and liturgical continuity within remaining Eastern-controlled areas. These documents establish formal procedural management of ecclesiastical authority in contested regions, further codifying the separation between churches. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 represents the culmination of documented institutional divergence. Papal registers from Innocent III confirm the authorization and oversight of Crusader contingents, the installation of Latin ecclesiastical authority, and the codified administration of dioceses in Constantinople and surrounding territories. Byzantine chronicles, including the Chronicle of Nicetas Choniates, record the formal seizure of the city, the displacement of the patriarchate, and the preservation of canonical oversight for remaining Eastern clergy. Latin charters document the transfer of ecclesiastical property, liturgical instruments, and administrative structures to Western oversight. Byzantine synodal acts confirm procedural enforcement of Eastern canonical norms among surviving clergy. Collectively, these sources demonstrate the operational and verifiable institutional consequences of the 1204 occupation, confirming the permanent nature of ecclesiastical separation. Throughout the period 863 to 1204, historical documentation demonstrates a continuous process of codification and consolidation. Papal registers, synodal acts, correspondence, charters, and episcopal records provide uninterrupted evidence of canonical enforcement, hierarchical administration, and liturgical practice. These sources confirm that separation between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches was maintained through structured, formal mechanisms rather than anecdotal, legendary, or informal processes. Each stage, from the Photian dispute, the Filioque controversy, the Crusades, and the Fourth Crusade, produced codified evidence reinforcing operational, doctrinal, and institutional divergence. In summary, the historical record establishes that the Great Schism was a series of formally documented and codified developments, beginning with procedural disputes over patriarchal succession in 863, continuing through doctrinal and liturgical divergence, and culminating in the institutional consequences of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The preserved documentation demonstrates continuous administrative and canonical engagement, the formal application of law, and structured enforcement of hierarchical authority. Both churches systematically codified governance, sacramental practice, and disciplinary procedures within their respective spheres, creating verifiable, operational, and permanent separation. The events of 1204 solidified this divergence, confirming the enduring institutional reality of the schism, fully documented through contemporary sources. The period from 863 to 1204 demonstrates that the separation of East and West was neither instantaneous nor accidental, but a continuous, documented, and codified process. Papal registers, Byzantine synodal acts, letters, charters, and chronicles collectively provide verifiable evidence of hierarchical, liturgical, and doctrinal consolidation on both sides. The cumulative effect of these codified actions established enduring institutional boundaries that define the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches and ensured that the procedural and doctrinal separation established during the 11th century became permanently embedded within ecclesiastical structures.